Hi, I'm Stewart Spinks and welcome to episode 316 of my podcast, Beekeeping Short and Sweet. It's been a good week. The nukes are growing very nicely and there are more drawn frames now than foundation. It's looking really positive. Elsewhere, I've been preparing the honey room for the long-awaited summer honey extraction, and I thought you might like to hear about the equipment that we have ready for this year's task. Beekeeping Short and Sweet, a beekeeping podcast for the inquisitive beekeeper with a short attention span. A beekeeper, in fact, just like me. Hi everyone, welcome to my office here in Norwich on a wet and windy morning. Actually, as I record, it's the day after a very wet and windy, 24 hours I guess. Saturday was pretty much rain all day, and it's been quite cool. Of course, that means I'm already fretting about the bees on the moors, because if it's cool in Norwich, then it's going to be cold on the high moors. A breezy day here translates into a gale on the heather, so I really feel the need to get back and check in on them. That said, workload is going to keep me away for at least another fortnight, and then it will be time to bring them home. So I'm going to have to take a pragmatic approach and say what will be, will be. At least they're all clipped up and safe and secure on their pallets, so they shouldn't take any real harm. Later today, I'm off to the borage site to gather up the colonies that we took down there for the summer and return them back to the fishing lakes. I spent some time this week cutting the grass and setting out a range of stands in readiness for tonight's trip. Everything's in place and it should go fairly straightforwardly and hopefully be quite easy to get them all back. It's just another very late night. I don't like collecting our bees until they're all back in their hives, and that's going to be around 8:30 to 9 o'clock, maybe a little earlier. But of course, the weather has now changed back to summer conditions with warm, dry days and higher overnight temperatures once more, so the bees will take every opportunity to fly out and find what forage they can, until, of course, the light fades. It does look like the weather is now set fair locally for us for some time. Looking at the online weather forecast, it appears dry and warm for the next fortnight at least, so we should now be able to get our colonies settled back and building up nicely for the winter months ahead. It's a shame it's all too late for a honey crop, but as we saw last week, the ivy is now starting to flower, so there may be a late crop of honey from that. The good news with the weather is that the splits and shook swarms we created have a window of at least 2 weeks on higher overnight temperatures that will enable them to continue to look after what brood they have and keep growing in preparation for the winter. I'm feeling quite optimistic about this. To recap, we carried out many shook swarms from our Langstroth hives into 14 by 12 BS honeybee nuke boxes. These are 6-frame nuke boxes, and we added a new caged queen at the same time and settled them down in various locations. We also split a couple of very strong 14 by 12 hives into 2-frame nukes and gave those a queen too. In total, we have 25 new queens added to these nukes, and of these, just one has yet to start laying. The rest have all sprinted away and have growing brood nest areas. The non-laying queen is likely to have a problem, sad to say. Something not quite right physically, most likely, and I'll be chatting to Luke at Northumberland Honey to get a replacement. It's really important that if you do buy in a new queen, you give her time to settle in and start laying. But how long is long enough? Well, I would say if she's not laying after a fortnight, a call needs to be made. Your supplier may ask for the queen to be returned to them, so don't get rid of her until you've had that conversation. These nukes that we've prepared are all at varying stages of growth. Some are almost completely across all 6 frames, and by that what I mean is that they have drawn comb on all 6 frames on both sides, whereas others are only on 3 or 4 frames. It's really important to keep the food levels topped up and that they have as much as they need to continue to produce wax and draw out that comb. That's why I'm so happy to see a couple of weeks of warm weather. It's really going to help. We're using fondant to feed our nukes. I've probably mentioned that before. I bought it a couple of years ago to feed over winter, an entire pallet of the stuff, and wouldn't you just know it, the bees didn't want any feed over that winter at all. So here we are with a pallet of fondant gathering dust. I think it's a really good example of how our bees will use whatever they've been given. I know you could argue that if they had light syrup it would encourage the queen to lay more eggs, but honestly, in the nukes I've checked so far, they're doing just fine. At least 3 frames of brood already in some cases, so I don't think it's an issue. It just goes to show you that although beekeepers will insist you follow a specific feeding regime of light syrup or heavy syrup through the active season and fondant only in the depths of winter, actually it doesn't really matter. In fact, I've found it easier to feed with fondant as it's far less messy and actually very competitively priced when compared to liquid feeds. We'll give the nukes another week and then I'll check them again. Most have had around 6 kilos of fondant so far and it seems to be working really well. When I check them next time, I'll be looking for 2 things. Actually, I'll be looking for a lot more than 2 things, but specifically a laying queen and the number of drawn frames. The third thing, I guess, is healthy bees as an additional consideration. This because it will be time to consider giving any weaker nukes a helping hand, while at the same time taking any overcrowding off those most vigorous colonies. I'll do this by removing fully drawn frames of food, possibly brood, from the biggest, strongest colonies and swapping them for frames of foundation from those smallest, weaker ones. The foundation will go into the stronger colonies for them to work on, and those drawn frames will give the smaller colonies a gentle boost and hopefully encourage their queen to get cracking with a larger brood nest area. Honestly, I don't think we'll need to do much of that at all, if any swapping around really. This is why bee health is so important. If you're going to swap frames from colony to colony, you really must know your bees are healthy before you start moving them around. I guess I would anticipate maybe just 2 or 3 smaller colonies needing help out of the 25 total, and that's not bad at all. You may be thinking, why would there be such small colonies when we've given them very similar queens? Well, it all comes down to how they were split, and honestly, there were 2 or 3 that didn't have many bees in them at all. These were the ones with a frame of brood from the 14 by 12 splits. Now, I'm hopeful these will have had that sealed brood emerge and boost the colony population to the point that they really won't need any intervention. But I'm on standby to help out if I think it will do them some good. It is possible the very biggest colonies could go into a full-size hive, but that's a consideration for another time, and it will mean making up more brood frames, something I don't think I'll have time to do. Better to have a very strong nuke than a weaker full-size hive to take through the autumn and over winter. So with that in the back of my mind, it's also time to think about the honey room. I haven't really started any honey extraction as yet, apart from using the appy melter to melt out granulated oilseed rape honey, something we have quite a bit of at the moment. My honey room has changed over the years. I've added equipment, changed and upgraded various bits of the process, and now have something of a system that works for me with the number of colonies that we have. And I really think that's an important point to make. It's what works for you. There's no right or wrong system if it exactly suits how you want to extract and store your honey. Our very first extraction was a joy. I think we managed to get a couple of supers of honey or thereabouts. That amount of honey would barely be enough to fill all of the equipment and hoses in readiness to begin extracting with the equipment that we have today. So you see, it really does depend on your beekeeping and the setup that you have. We've added a new bit of equipment this year too. I've not yet had it working, so I have no idea if it will be the final piece of the jigsaw puzzle to give me exactly what I want. More of that in a moment. But I think I've mentioned all of the equipment that we do have previously, but here's an updated current list for you, especially for those who are thinking about what equipment you might like to have. We stack our supers on wheel dollies to move them around. Most are 19mm ply with casters screwed to the bottom, but I did buy a few ready-made dollies from a supermarket locally a couple of years ago. These work well, but are rectangular and not quite large enough, so there is a danger of a tall stack toppling over if you don't take great care. 10 supers piled high, weighing in excess of 150 to 200 kilos, is not something you want falling over onto your leg or foot, so you do have to watch what you're doing very closely. I will eventually swap them out, but they'll do for now. My extraction line is pretty straightforward really, and it has its pros and cons as most do. Let's start at the beginning and work through to the bucket of honey at the end. First up, we have our Legger uncapping tank and stand with our Carl Fritz brush uncapper fitted to it. The Legger tank came from Maysmore apiaries and is the perfect size for the Carl Fritz unit. It's quite a small unit, but honestly, it's all that we need. There is a drain tap fitted to the base, and the brush uncapper sits across the tank, giving plenty of room to hold the frames against it. We give the frames in the super a scrape across the top bars and bottom to remove any brace comb and to generally clean them up. It makes it easier when we follow the process of extraction through. The frame is taken out and held against the brush uncapper and lifted against it to allow the nylon bristles to flick off the wax cappings, exposing the honey within. I should add that we keep the supers warm in our converted walk-in fridge. A gentle heat keeps the honey nice and fluid so that the extraction draws out as much as we can possibly get. Once both sides of the frame have been uncapped, the frame is placed on our frame carousel. It holds up to 72 frames. It's a large piece of equipment that takes up quite a big footprint on the honey room floor, but it's well worth it. The carousel has a large stainless steel bowl that collects all the honey dripping from the frames prior to them going into the extractor. Again, there's a tap in the bottom of the bowl that allows me to drain the honey collecting in it into a bucket. One modification I want to add here is a hose to allow the honey to flow continuously into the honey sump, and more about that shortly. The carousel is there to help with workflow. We can get more frames uncapped while the extractor is doing its thing, and by allowing the frames to sit on the carousel prior to going into the extractor, quite a bit of honey within each frame runs out, making the time spent in the extractor far less. It also keeps my nephew busy uncapping frames while I stand over the extractor watching what everyone else is up to. The extractor is a Legger Flamingo 28 frame radial extractor. It's one of my all-time favourite bits of equipment. It's very, very quiet, and I've heard the noise it makes described as a quiet tube train. So we generally have 9 frames within each super. So that's 3 supers worth of frames into the extractor at one go. I know the maths don't quite add up, but you get my meaning. It's a very valuable time saver, especially when I think back to the 2-frame tangential galvanised hand-cranked extractor that I started out with. We now come to the exciting new piece of equipment, the Thomas Clinomel decanter tray, as they describe it. It's a sump, basically. The tank is 50 centimetres in diameter and about 30 centimetres deep. It has 2 strainers in it, one very coarse and the other coarse. This is a pre-strainer to take large bits of wax out of the honey prior to going through the pump and into the settling tank. We used to have a honey sump with strainers in it, but they always got so badly clogged up that we spent a lot of time scraping them down to allow the honey to pass through. I've changed the way that we clean the honey, if clean is the right word. Strain is probably a better word though. I've changed the way that we strain the honey. Our customers want as much goodness, I'll call it, left in the honey as possible, and so we don't pass the honey through fine micro strainers or filters anymore, not for the most part anyway. The Clinomel is basically replacing the sump. It sits beneath the extractor and takes the honey from the extractor and takes those larger lumps of wax out, the ones where frames occasionally blow while you're extracting. We have a float switch fitted to the new sump, and hopefully, as I haven't tried it as yet, hopefully when the honey level of the sump reaches a predefined point, the switch will fire up our Lyson honey pump and send it on its way into our very large 500 kilo settling tank, which sits upon a stand so that the honey buckets can go beneath the tap and be filled the following day. That 24-hour standing period allows all the suspended wax and other debris to either float to the surface or sink to the base. The honey tap, being set a few centimetres above the floor of the settling tank, allows perfectly clean honey to come out into our buckets for storage. Where we have smaller quantities, let's say specific monofloral honey, such as the clover that I think we have from our single small apiary, I can pump that honey into a 100 kilo settling tank and use that instead of taking up the enormous 500 kilo tank. If we have a really good crop of honey from, let's say, the borage, another option we have is to recycle the honey back through the cleaned sump and pump and send it into 300 kilo barrels. Storage of the honey is so much easier in barrels and it takes up a lot less room. And that's it really. That's my current honey room extraction setup, all of which will be put into action, hopefully, next week. I hope you've had a great year of honey production and that you've already completed your extraction, or at least you have it planned, as I do. Good luck with it if you're about to start the process too. I know how much of a sticky mess it can be. Well, that's it for this week. Don't forget to check out my website, www.norfolk-honey.co.uk, and for my latest videos and podcasts with more updates, tips and techniques, it's the same Patreon page, www.patreon.com/Norfolk Honey. And remember, I'm Stewart Spinks, and that was Beekeeping Short and Sweet.